All right, let's talk about one of the most fascinating and honestly misunderstood relationships in all of American history. We're talking about the Freemasons and their role in the birth of a nation.
Whoa. I mean, that is a bombshell of a claim, right? The idea that some secret society was pulling all the strings behind the American Revolution, it sounds like something straight out of a movie. But it makes you stop and ask a pretty serious question.
So, what's the real story here? Did the Freemasons secretly plot the American Revolution? That is the big question we are going to tackle today. We're going to dig into the history, separate the myths from the facts, and see what we can find out. All right, so to really get into this, we first have to understand what Freemasonry was even about back then. What were the core ideas that brought all these guys together in their lodges? Well, the main idea, and George Washington himself said this, was to promote the happiness of the human race. Now, in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, that was a pretty radical idea. See, they believed you couldn't have true happiness without freedom. The two went hand in hand, products of what they called natural law.
Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting. You've got this central paradox right in their own rulebook. Their official constitution from 1723 is super clear. No plots, no conspiracies. A Mason is supposed to be a peaceful citizen. But, and this is a big but, there's this fascinating loophole. If a brother does become a rebel, the lodge has to officially disown his rebellion. But get this, they can't kick him out. It's like they're saying, hey, one person's traitor is another's patriot, and the code kind of leaves room for that.
So these ideas didn't just stay in a philosophy book. They spread, and they spread fast. They created this really unique social network that connected all 13 colonies, which back then were pretty different from each other.
And you can see just how quickly it happened. Lodges started popping up everywhere, connecting these influential guys from Boston all the way down to Georgia. Now you gotta remember, a trip between those two cities could take 3 weeks on horseback. Each colony was like its own little country, but Freemasonry, it gave them a shared identity, a way to communicate that just didn't exist anywhere else.
And a huge part of how these ideas spread was through military lodges. Think about it, these were basically mobile clubs that traveled with the British Army. They'd hold their meetings anywhere they could, in tents, in caves, and inside that space, the whole rigid military structure just disappeared.
So here's the key takeaway. These lodges became these little incubators for revolutionary ideas, even if they never talked about revolution out loud. I mean, you could have a private in the army who was the master of his lodge, and in that room he outranked a major. You had guys with no formal schooling learning how to lead, how to hold democratic elections, how to run things. They were getting a crash course in the rights of man. It was like the lodges were giving colonists the social software for how to govern themselves.
Okay, so now let's zoom in on Boston. This is where things really start to heat up. And we're going to look at one particular lodge. A lodge that was a major exception to that whole no politics rule.
Yeah, while most lodges were trying to stay out of politics, St. Andrew's Lodge, meeting at the Green Dragon Tavern, was totally different. It was packed with guys who had become the absolute biggest names in the fight for independence. And this wasn't an elite club. It was a working man's lodge, full of laborers, sailors, and craftsmen from the docks.
I mean, look at this list. It's basically a who's who of American patriots. You've got Paul Revere, John Hancock, Dr. Joseph Warren, James Otis. Every single one of them was a member of this one single radical lodge.
And that famous phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny, that came from a member of St. Andrews, James Otis. He's the one who coined it way back in 1761 when he was arguing against these general search warrants from the Crown. He called them instruments of slavery, and that speech is basically seen as the first shot fired in the Revolution.
And get this, the lodge actually bought the tavern in 1764. So this is where that line between a friendly fraternal meeting and, well, revolutionary plotting gets really, really blurry. That tavern's meeting room, it was used by pretty much every radical group in Boston, and it all led up to one of the most famous protests in history.
Yep, we're talking about the Boston Tea Party. There's really no doubt it was planned by guys from St. Andrew's Lodge, and we have a pretty good clue how we know. The official minutes from the lodge on that very night, they just say the meeting was closed early on account of the few members present. Why? Because they were all down at the harbor, dressed as Mohawks. Now to be clear, they weren't acting as Masons, they were acting as patriots, but they were absolutely using their Masonic network and their meeting spot to get it done.
Okay, so St. Andrews was clearly a hotbed of radical activity. So does that mean we've proven it? Does that prove the whole conspiracy theory we started with? Was this all a grand Masonic plot?
Well, not so fast. Because for every rebel lodge like St. Andrew's, you had other lodges that were filled with guys who were loyal to the king. See, Freemasonry itself was split. St. Andrew's was what they called an Ancients Lodge, working-class guys, Scottish roots. But Boston also had Moderns lodges, chartered from England, and they were full of royal officials and businessmen who were, you guessed it, overwhelmingly loyalist. So Freemasonry was on both sides of this fight.
And this is maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. Think about it. There were over 100 Masonic lodges scattered across the colonies. And out of all of them, only one, just St. Andrew's in Boston, can really be pointed to as this organized center of rebellion. It was the exception, a very powerful one, but it wasn't the rule.
So, that really brings us to the final verdict. It wasn't a Masonic revolution, but it was absolutely a revolution of Masons. The organization itself didn't orchestrate the war, but its ideals, they provided the philosophical fuel. Its network, it provided the connections, and its meeting rooms provided the perfect space for these men who just so happened to be Masons to turn into revolutionaries.
So if it wasn't some secret plot, what does this whole story really tell us? I think it shows that sometimes the most powerful engine for change isn't some grand conspiracy from the top. It's a network built from the ground up, based on shared ideas. It's about giving people a space where they can learn to lead, to govern themselves, and to imagine that a better, freer world is actually possible.